Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out to the penultimate Center for the Humanities book talk at Books and Books this year. I'm Phil Harling, the director of the Center for the Humanities, and it's always really fun to put on this particular show. I want to thank Christina Larson and Sydney Shamblin for helping out tonight, as they always do, so reliably, so efficiently, so effectively, and Books and Books, of course, for hosting. As is our wont for the book talks, I'm going to give just a brief introduction to the person who will introduce our speaker. And so it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium Gema Perez Sanchez, who's an Associate Professor of Spanish in the Modern Languages and Literatures Department at UM. Gema researches contemporary Spanish narrative and film, cultural studies, migration studies, transnational LGBTQ activism, and queer theory. In addition to many other publications, she's the author of the monograph Queer Transitions in Contemporary Spanish Culture, From Franco to La Movida. And now she's hard at work on her next book, which is the working title of which is Transnational Queer Affects and Activism, Literary and Visual Public Interventions in Spanish Culture, 1970s to the 2000s, which studies the intersection of epistolary, literary, visual, and activist discourses, and transnational lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and queer mobilizations in contemporary Spain at two key historical junctures, the early 1970s with the end of the Franco regime, and then also the early 2000s during the political debates in Spain around the passing of the laws legalizing same-sex marriage. So Gema, please come on up and welcome Pamela.
Thank you. I did not expect to be introduced. It's kind of introducing the introducer. Well, welcome everybody. I am privileged to introduce my very good friend, collaborator, and colleague of many years, Pamela Geller, who will be presenting today her brilliant book, Becoming Object, the Sociopolitics of the Samuel George Morton Cranial Collection, published very recently, but in 2024, by the University of Florida Press. An associate professor, soon to be full professor, I hear, in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Miami, where she has worked since 2008. Pamela holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Pennsylvania, an MA in anthropology from the University of Chicago, and a BA magna cum laude in anthropology with a minor in English, also from the University of Pennsylvania. Now, the minor in English is significant because I think it explains Pamela's exquisite writing. She's really an excellent writer. Prior to coming to UM, Pamela held academic positions at Arizona State University and American University. Since 2010, yes, she has served as consulting scholar in the American section of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. Over her many years of bioarchaeological work, she has conducted field work in Hawaii, Belize, Honduras, Peru, and Haiti. And I'm told that's very important for archaeologists and anthropologists to mention this places of research. Her research and teaching interests, I mean, most of you know her, but I will repeat for people who don't, include archaeology and bioarchaeology, feminist and queer studies, materiality of identity, the sociopolitics of the past, and bioethics. Pamela's an incredibly prolific writer. And I thought I knew something for a fact, but she just dispelled that fact and corrected me, which is that when in nights of insomnia, she will just get up and write her research. But apparently what she does is she keeps a journal next to her, and then if an idea is bothering her or in her head and she can't sleep, she'll get up and write it. It still boggles the mind, but it also explains her productivity. She's the author of 3 peer-reviewed monographs, 2 edited volumes, 27 peer-reviewed journal articles, and book chapters, 24 of which are single-authored, in addition to many public-facing editorial pieces, interviews, and other features, which have appeared in venues such as the New York Times, Slate, CNN, the Miami Herald, and The Conversation. And she has a lot more work in production right now. So I have left those aside, but there's another monograph in production. There's several articles that are under consideration, and she's writing a couple more. The public-facing pieces, and some of her most recent academic ones, address the question of what it means to be human in an age of unprecedented anthropogenic impact on this planet. As she indicates on her website, this are her own words, the question is a long-standing one for anthropology. It seeks to address how the human condition shifts with technological innovation and socioeconomic interaction, as was the case during the Neolithic or Industrial Revolutions. Yet rather than look to ancient periods, Pamela undertakes an archaeology of the contemporary that focuses on plastics as material culture in the 21st century. She's particularly intrigued by the cultural maladaptability, ontological and biophysical implications, and future history of plastics. Her research in plastics at UM was supported by a ULink grant, and she's also the recipient of many other intramural and extramural grants. And we're all obsessed about plastics now. We're just talking about that. We're seeing them everywhere. Every time you talk to Pamela, she'll point out to where the plastics are. So she is really good at raising consciousness about that. In addition to all that work, she also has edited volumes that include Feminist Anthropology, Past, Present, and Future, published with the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2006, prior to coming to UM, and the Routledge Handbook of Feminist Anthropology, which was just published this very year. Currently, she serves as the specialty chief editor of Human Bioarchaeology and Paleopathology for the open access journal Frontiers in Environmental Archaeology. She's also series editor for Archaeology of Gender and Sexuality, a book series with Routledge Press. She has given numerous invited lectures nationally and internationally, including at such prestigious institutions as Cornell University, my alma mater, University of Pennsylvania, University of California, Berkeley, and Uppsala University in Sweden, and many others domestically. Before I conclude my introduction, let me tell you a bit about her two prior monographs. In 2017, she published The Field Shattering the Bioarchaeology of Social Sexual Lives, Queering Common Sense About Sex, Gender, and Sexuality, published with Springer Press. In that pioneering book, she investigated bioarchaeological remains to examine the complexities and diversity of past sociosexual lives. Unlike standard practice in the field until that point, her book did not begin with the presumption that certain aspects of sex, gender, and sexuality are universal and long-standing. Instead, she looked at case studies from Neolithic Europe to pre-Columbian Mesoamerica to the 19th century United States to highlight the importance of culturally and historically contextualizing sociosexual beliefs and practices. In this work, she interrogates commonsensical thinking about sociosexual identities and interactions, drawing for her critique from feminist and queer studies to invite readers to think more deeply about humanity's diversity, the naturalization of culture, and the past presentation in mass media communications. This is like a thread in Pamela's work, the challenge in the commonsensical, and how it has become solidified through history, and how we don't think about how certain bodies are regulated as a given. So this is something that actually she does very well in this book, by the way. Her second monograph, prior to becoming Object, Theorizing Bioarchaeology, also published with Springer Press in 2021, is a more theoretical book that addresses how bioarchaeology has relied on Darwinian perspectives and biocultural models to communicate information about the lives of past peoples. In that book, she demonstrates how further theoretical expansion, and by this she means a thoughtful engagement with critical social theorizing, can contribute insightful and more ethical outcomes. To do so, Pamela focuses on social theoretical concepts of pertinence to biological studies, not just bioarchaeological studies, actually also for cultural studies, my field, for example, such as habitus, the normal, intersectionality, necropolitics, and bioethos. Necropolitics is a big component of her new book, so that will be something that she will likely be talking about. In Theorizing Bioarchaeology, she argues that these concepts can deepen the study of plasticity, disease, gender, violence, and race and ethnicity, as well as advance the field's decolonization efforts. And those efforts at decolonizing the field are also central to becoming Object. So there's a real logical trajectory to all of her monographs. So finally, we get to the book she will present here today, Becoming Object, the Sociopolitics of the Samuel George Morton Cranial Collection. This is a... Sorry? Okay, somebody's testing. This is a beautifully written, erudite book that nevertheless is written in an approachable style that an educated non-academic audience will enjoy. I was just saying a moment ago that if you read the New York Times and you're not an academic, you will really enjoy this book. In fact, I think it's hard to put down. It's a true page turner. You want to really know what happened with Samuel. What is his story? What is going on? What about all this archives? And this crania, why did people write on the cranium? The crania. So you'll find all of that if you get this book. To write this superb piece of decolonial scholarship, Pamela spent years researching not only the Samuel George Morton Cranial collection at Penn, doing the hardcore work of bioarchaeologists. Okay, I'm sorry.
Make your way to the door here.
All right. Should we wait
365 folks.
for a minute?
Little presentation.
That's all right. Well, there's a little bit of science. I said that.
Dueling events or something, I'm sorry.
That's okay. This is very this is like an archive. There's like layers.
Yeah.
Is the oral palimpsest.
Read it.
We'll wait a little bit. That's it's very interesting. Very postmodern.
Can't hear me. I've got a lot.
Go ahead.
All right.
Thank you,
Okay.
Steve.
Thanks. Well, what I was saying is that I'll go back to what I was saying. To write this superb piece of decolonial scholarship, Pamela spent years researching not only the Samuel George Morton Cranial collection at Penn, doing the hardcore work of a bioarchaeologist, that is conducting forensic and craniometric studies, but also performing a staggering amount of deep dive historical archival work at institutions such as, and the list is long, but I want to read it because I think it speaks to the depth of Pamela's research and the erudition of her work, and also the overlap with history. So institutions such as the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, the American Philosophical Society, the Academy of Natural Sciences, Atathiki Museum, College of Physicians of Philadelphia, the National Archives in Washington, D.C., Penn Museum, the University of Miami's Special Collection at Richter Library, and Worcester Institute, in addition to having conducted extensive online research on digitalized sources at several other universities and archives. In short, in this brilliant book, Pamela combines masterfully her expertise in life sciences, archaeology, anthropology, and history, or as she puts it, she joins, quote, the biological and historical together, quote, to document a process of racialization or the making of race during a pivotal historical and sociopolitical moment. And this moment is the post-revolutionary years of the colonial expansionism of the United States, following independence in 1776, so basically early 19th century and beyond. Pamela's findings in this book have very important implications for the current moment in our country in general, and for Florida in particular, as she no doubt will present in terms of the relationship to Seminole Indians or tribes. And I just want to finish my presentation. I was only given 5 minutes, so I just want to finish with a personal note to express my admiration for Pamela, not just as a stellar scholar, but as an upstanding human being who has been a steadfast ally of those of us in the LGBTQI plus community and to racialized groups. She's a selfless, supportive friend and a model of scholarly ethics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pamela Geller.
Thanks, Hannah. That was so lovely. All right. Okay. So 3 years ago, I was a fellow at the UM Center for the Humanities, and you can attest that this was in a post-pandemic world, so there was some challenges, but I so appreciated the fellows that were fellowing with me, as well as Hugh, who was the director at the time. And I'd like to acknowledge him and Phil Harling and Christina Larson, who is the current director and the current assistant director at the center, who have been instrumental in organizing this talk. And I'd also like to thank Books and Books. Since moving to Miami almost 18 years ago, Books and Books has been a happy place for me in Miami, and I've got to see my daughter age out of the children's room over there, and I've got to come to wonderful talks like this. And my only gripe, which is more like a plea, is that you guys reopen a Books and Books on the Beach, because that also was lost during the pandemic, because I think the world needs more places that house knowledge and create community and smell like the pages of a book, like this does. So I think that's actually where I want to start today, talk about becoming object with the smell of books and the knowledge to be gleaned from them, particularly old ones contained within archives. Okay, so in the summer of 2012, I was conducting research. Okay, these are my parents, so this is why they feel compelled to be able to do that. Okay. Oy vey. In the summer of 2012, I was conducting research at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, and the Academy's archive was providing a respite from the city's noise and stifling humidity. But one July day, because Philly is a hot mess in July, the air conditioning sputtering made clear how very tired it had become. And this was not surprising. The building, originally dated to 1876, which is depicted in the slide, and refitting it with modern conveniences like air conditioning, had presented a structural challenge. And so as the day wore on and the heat encroached, I found it more difficult to concentrate on the chicken scratch scrawl that passed for penmanship in the letters I was transcribing. Welcome interruption came in the form of a passing librarian, and she leaned over my laptop and she whispered, "Legend has it, John James Audubon really collected the skulls Morton claimed as his own." And I mulled over the implications of her hushed words. While I knew Audubon did collect human skulls, several of which he then passed on to Dr. Samuel George Morton, there's little dispute that ornithology remained his passion. The man liked birds, and you can see in the image the American flamingo from his 1838 Birds of America, which was spotted along the Florida southeastern coast. So, less a plot twist in the tale of the Samuel George Morton Cranial collection, the librarian's offhanded comment reminded me about the controversy and confusion that have long surrounded Morton and the skulls he collected. And so, as not to contribute to this controversy, I will not be showing photographs of the actual skulls for several reasons. Cultural insensitivity, for one, permissions not granted by descendant communities who recognize these individuals as ancestors being another reason. So in lieu of photographs, I'm going to show illustrations when available, like the plate that's shown in the image, which is from Morton's Cranial Americana. So, for those of you who know nothing about Morton, he was a Philadelphia physician and natural historian and one of the forefathers of American anthropology. And he's born in 1799 and he dies in 1851. And he is best known for two things. One, a skull collection comprised of about 1,000 quote-unquote specimens that continued to grow, became bigger, people added to it after he died. And then two, measuring those skulls for their cranial capacities. And he did this to test a hypothesis about the link between intelligence and race. And from his calculations, Morton ranked racial groups, arguing that big-brain Caucasians were superior to small-skulled American Indians and even smaller-skulled Black Africans. And he laid out his ideas in myriad publications, including his best-known work, Cranial Americana. And here is the 1839 frontispiece, which is pictured in the slide with the title and the skulls that he depicted them in them. So in a day and age when brain size mattered, bigger meant something, efforts by men of science and medicine to make live went hand in glove with their creation of ungrievable lives, those who they let die or transformed into biological and cultural threats. So how does this play out in Morton's career? Well, as a physician, he worked to racialize diseases. In the preface to his illustrations of pulmonary consumption, which we call tuberculosis today, Morton alluded to the opportunities presented by the precarity of American Indians. The decreasing prevalence of consumption, he proposed, correlated with the progress of cultivation and civilization. And to address this hypothesis, to turn correlation into causation, additional study of Native peoples, who he believed suffered disproportionately from the disease, was encouraged. And he writes in there, "Medical men attached to the Army have great facilities for inquiries of this kind, and those who reside in the vicinity of the Indian tribes have it in their power to communicate much valuable information." The book also contains a telling footnote about African Americans. Negroes are, of course, left out of the calculation. Their predisposition to phthisis, however, is familiar to every American physician. This is what he says. So physicians could then invoke predisposition to absolve themselves of letting others die. In due time, Morton's medical practice takes a backseat to natural history, as I discussed in chapter 2 of the book. There are several reasons for the shift, though the most consequential one was his impotence in the face of infectious diseases. There was the yellow fever outbreak of 1799 that caused his father's death just 6 months after Morton was born, the cholera epidemic of 1832 that wiped out the inmates he ministered to at the Philadelphia Almshouse, and the scarlet fever episodes that cut short the lives of his 2 young nieces. As a physician, he had been held accountable to those who mourned the ones they lost, but with skulls, there was little to remind him of decomposition's myths, decedents' identities, or loved ones' grief. No one required him to explain or apologize when it came to the skulls. Morton did collect skulls while on medical staff at the almshouse, staking his claim on the cadavers and crania of its incarcerated paupers, whose poverty precluded their consent. But in 1830, he cast his net wider, and he solicited military and medical officers, the same ones he asked for information about the racial aspects of disease. In his own words. Let's see if it comes up. Okay. I commenced the study of ethnology in 1830, in which year, having occasion to deliver an introductory lecture on anatomy, it occurred to me to illustrate the difference in the form of the skull as seen in the 5 great races of men. While the statement reads like an epiphany, there is something more insidious at work here. His efforts signal a transition from letting die to making the future dead, and they are helped along by political policy that is taking shape during his interesting times. So we need to backtrack a year to realize what's going on here. In December 8th of 1829, President Andrew Jackson gave his first annual address to Congress, and in it he opined that the government's past efforts to civilize natives had been unsuccessful. The humane option was to forcibly relocate them to territories west of the Mississippi River. The proposed policy was a departure from previous presidential administrations, it was unprecedented, which had supported relocation but drew the line at mandated removal. Removal, Jackson rationalized, would benefit white settlers, further states' economic interests, and safeguard national borders. It was also in the best interest of Indians, the president claimed. Under the guise of paternalism, Jackson then signed into law the Indian Removal Act of 1830. It would be the most significant piece of legislation enacted during his 2-term presidency. So to carry out this final solution, U.S. troops began forcibly removing Native Americans from their lands. Prior to migration, they experienced impoverishment, starvation, violence, and existential insecurity. And these precarious conditions took root when they settled on reservations. This humanitarian crisis did engender congressional opposition, public outrage, Native resistance, and lawsuits. But these responses ultimately failed in the face of such bald necropolitics. And the political cartoon on the slide depicts, closer to me, 6 Native Americans in a cage with one saying, "Home sweet home." And on the cage, we see a waving flag with the phrase, "Rights of Man." So, in addition to laws, governments have used and continue to use multiple necropolitical techniques to target and terrorize certain populations. During 19th century American nation building, necropolitics also included rhetorical strategies that advanced the ethnic or racial distinctions between us and them, or in the case of Native Americans, friendly and hostile. So friendly were those who agreed to relocate versus hostile who resisted that relocation. We also see segregation, whether it's on reservations or in slave quarters or in concentration camps, that are spatially reinforcing these differences. And then there's technological interventions, guns, bayonets, bloodhounds, they all make it die. The slide depicts a political cartoon titled "Hunting Indians in Florida with Bloodhounds," and it features multiple techniques: bloodhounds burning villages, upset children and women, bayonets, and racial slurs that were used by Zachary Taylor, who commanded U.S. forces against the Seminole Indians during the Second Seminole War, and then he would go on to be the nation's 12th president. Now, while my own analysis of crania comprising the Morton collection display no evidence of bloodhound-inflicted violations, skulls do testify to the violence experienced by already vulnerable populations, as well as their erasure from the national consciousness by men of science, medicine, and the military. For Morton, implementation of aggressive expansionist policies and violent martial conflicts, it presented an opportunity. Removal of Indians by federal troops and local militia coincided with his push to collect crania in 1830. And Morton used his institutional connections and his scientific reputation to forge relationships with military and medical officers. And they complied with his requests or tasked underlings with the chore. It broke up the tedium of their downtime and it advanced science. And with the landscape depopulated of its native inhabitants, these men faced little pushback. And so they plundered graves, and they fragmented skulls from bodies strewn across battlefields. And Morton's willingness to acquire skulls in such a manner indicates his complete break with the Quaker religious doctrine of his childhood, one that had long advocated for pacifism, conscious objection, and the immorality of dispossessing natives of their ancestral lands. Now in chapters 3 and 4 of Becoming Object, I turn from Morton to detail the activities of the men who aided him. So this one. This is Colonel John J. Abert. He was the chief of the Corps of Topographical Engineers, and he collected a skull from Morton while mapping the nation's expanding borders. The entry hole in the back of the Seminole Indian skull indicates that he died around 30 to 40 years old when a musket ball lodged into his brain. And on the slide we can see Abert and the map that he made of Florida for the War Department before going on to map the American West. So Abert is very much tied in with Manifest Destiny, because in order to figure out where the nation is, you got to figure out what its borders are, and he was instrumental in doing that. Here we have Captain Justin Dimmick. Morton is indebted to him for sending along a skull that also bears entry and exit holes of a fatal gunshot. And the narrative included in Cranial Americana repeats the ones in military reports and newspapers that celebrated Dimmick for his bravery. It reads, "At the moment Captain D raised his gun, a double-barrel fowling piece, and shot both of the Indians in succession. The enemies, one of whom, the subject of the annexed drawing, he found already dead by a ball through the head, while the other one was merely wounded. The latter one was at once dispatched by a thrust of the bayonet, and thus by the singular bravery of Captain Dimmick, these two savages lay dead and side by side in a few moments after the action began." And this is what he's celebrated for. Here we have Hardy Croom. He is a white settler living on the Florida frontier who grew increasingly frustrated with the government's inadequate responses to hostile Indians. He collected a Seminole skull while expressing regret that he couldn't provide more. An exasperation, he was very exasperated that the Indian troubles in eastern Florida hindered his botanical work, he was a botanist, and threatened the security of his plantation and its enslaved occupants. Exemplifying necropolitics is U.S. Army surgeon Dr. Eugene Abadie. He was a French immigrant, he was an alum of Penn's Med School, and he was a first-hand witness to the removal of the Creeks. He made good on Morton's original request to document the prevalence of consumption during this time. And then, when he's reassigned to Florida at the midpoint of the Seminole Wars, he collects skulls from Morton. It was during the First Seminole War that Andrew Jackson, a general at the time, adopted a scorched earth policy. And the lithograph on the slide depicts the burning of Pilak Likaha by General Abraham Eustis in 1836. And this was a village that had been inhabited by Seminoles and Black Seminoles. When troops implemented these tactics during the Second Seminole War, medical officers like Abadie, who were sanctioned to make live, expressed little remorse. And this is a postscript, an afterthought, in a letter to Morton from Abadie. P.S. I would have written before this, but since I left Micanopy, I've been with Colonel Harney and 250 dragoons on an expedition of 20 days to the Suwannee, the Wakasasa, the Wikiawa, and the Withlacoochee rivers. It is but a few days since we have returned, having met no Indians, although we found 2 of their villages, which we burned. The destruction, which certainly generated precarity for Seminoles, seems to have engendered no bioethical quandary for Abadie. Rather, the postscript demonstrates medical officers' complicity and their casual cruelty, if not outright involvement in necropolitics. If anything, calculated destruction and indifference made collection of Seminole skulls all the easier. It certainly did for Abadie, who acquired 9 of the 21 Seminole skulls that are in the Morton collection. Some, like the individuals Morton labeled 726, 727, and 728, and 729, were exhumed from graves. And archival docs suggest that 2 of them, the top 2, were from Fort Gardner, and that the bottom 2 were near Tampa. 3 of them, if you can see, had been children. Their skulls bore the pathological marks of malnourishment, chronic infection, and stress. And we may attribute their compromised health statuses to the violent effects of U.S. military campaigns and forced removal. While Abadie may not have celebrated these untimely deaths, there is nothing to suggest that he or Morton saw them as worth fostering or grieving. So with casual cruelty, Abadie also collected skulls from Lake Okeechobee's battlefield. A month after fighting ceased, he encountered human remains, which he describes in this letter as scattered and bleaching in the sun. And he selects 2 of the least quote-unquote offensive skulls, and then Abadie, he boxes them up, and he sends them on to Philadelphia by way of the military's able quartermasters. And when Morton receives them, he designates them 730 and 732. One individual skull, 732, displayed trauma, so we see an unhealed fracture on it, on the forehead, and we see a slashed left cheek on it, which likely was received in the heat of battle. So once bodies and their parts were housed within scientific institutions, they became objects. Becoming object is underpinned by the somewhat counterintuitive notion that in being transformed from a human subject to an object, one can acquire a modicum of social value. As mentioned, skulls were numbered, information was inked on their surfaces, so we get information about age or sex or provenance, and then the handwritten script, which is very faded after so many years, attests to their use as teaching specimens. So on some crania, Morton writes the name of the cranial bones and the sutures, and he also writes metric information, so we get facial angles and we get information about the skull's internal cranial capacity. After Morton's death, colleagues purchased the collection and gifted it to the Academy of Natural Sciences in 1853, and then that institution loans it to Penn Museum in 1966, and the crania are renumbered, so when they're a loan, they're L606, and then when the Academy grants formal ownership to Penn in 1997, the L changes to a 97, and all of this is documented on the actual skulls. And with each movement from institution to institution and storage space to storage space, parts and information have gone missing. Sometimes it's inadvertent, in moving, maybe you lose a tooth, right? But sometimes it seems that there's something intentional going on with the information that goes missing. The men who originally acquired these skulls from Morton often worked to obfuscate information about their collecting activities, about they're working to how they're dehumanizing through fragmentation, and they're generating silences about decedents' biographies. And in so doing, those silences exclude or erase these individuals from the body politic. Yet, returning to the crania, I found also revealed information that countered these efforts to silence. And that the information points to the complexity and their heterogeneity of the nation in the 19th century. And there are traces in the collection of individuals with mixed race backgrounds like Black Indians, as well as female-bodied individuals who were instrumental in warfare and in political life. And I discuss these individuals and their sociopolitical implications in chapters 4 and 5 of the book. And there's also a few named individuals, but very few. So this one in particular. The skull, one Morton labeled 707, I think is illustrative. In Crania Americana, Morton writes that he was a, quote, seminal warrior of whose history nothing is known. And this is a silence, right? Archival sources provide an iota of additional information. The skull's point of collection to Aberdeen Morton was once again indebted, took place, quote, 12 miles south of the Sewanee River. Now, skeletal analysis extends this archival information, right? Cranial features indicate that the decedent was a male who died between the ages of 20 to 30 years of age. And while this individual possessed no trauma, we may assume he died violently given his warrior designation. And then curious and unexpected were the bold letters that I found just inked above his, quote, well-developed forehead. So written on the actual skull was the word Iokla Amathla in really big letters right around here. But archival or published sources make no mention of this name. What then to make of an alias, handwritten on a skull, but intentionally stricken from official texts? Despite the stubborn silences surrounding Iokla Amathla, is it possible to narrate his life in terms other than death and violence and victimization? Now, to make legible the name Iokla Amathla is to represent a cultural system with complex social practices and beliefs about names. Amathla translates into war leader, and for the Seminole, it was not a title that Muskogee speakers designated at birth, nor did they use it in a casual, familiar setting. As a man's civic title, an individual had to earn this honorific. Thus, given its association with age, gender, and social status, Amathla signals becoming, but not a becoming object, but becoming an esteemed, authoritative member of one's community. The meaning also changes with time, Iokla Amathla, right? English speakers come to mistranslate Amathla as a surname, and so its traditional significance becomes a casualty of colonialism. And yet I invoke Iokla Amathla not to recount a personal biography. There's silences, and there's just things we're not going to know about this person. And my intent is not to necessarily rechristen as Morton did when he designated the skull 707. Rather, the naming of Eokla Amathla humanizes a life ended and then expunged by necropolitical conditions and scientific opportunism. And such resurrection is an acknowledgement of ancestral agency, and it's a counter to erasures and the silences that have resulted. All right. So the housing of the individuals who compose the Morton collection in institutional settings, museum storerooms, scientific labs, classroom cabinets, offers a marked contrast to the final resting places of the men who acquired them. During the mid-19th century, the U.S.'s Cemetery Beautiful movement began, and situated on the rural outskirts of cities, and we can find this in cities all throughout the U.S., these cemeteries were designed with functionality and aesthetics in mind, and so mourning and socializing was occurring equally within these spaces. But access was restricted to upper and middle class white families, racial minorities, non-Christians, the poor, and other socially marginal people were excluded from these spaces, in life and in death. Abdi, for instance, was buried at the scenic Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis. The burial population is comprised mostly of the city's prominent white men and their families, and like just around the corner from Abdi's grave is William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, right? And Abdi's grave itself, which you can see in the picture, is situated atop a ridge that faces in the direction of the Mississippi River, so it's got a scenic view to it. And after his interment, after he dies in 1874 after a long and celebrated career in the military. His family follows in turn, so this becomes a family plot, right? And then the question is, what of Morton? After his passing on May 15th of 1851, family members and Academy colleagues gathered to bury his remains at Laurel Hill Cemetery. And so I will say also, as an aside, the book's dedicated to my parents for supporting me and humoring me. And this is my mom humoring me as I'm dragging her out to Laurel Hill Cemetery on 1 July, right after the pandemic, because I didn't been there. And I will also say that that's my parents met at a college right near Laurel Hill Cemetery. So they're more remiss for not having been there than me. But in time, most of Morton's immediate kin would be laid to rest in this family plot. A monument sculpted of marble was erected over the Morton's family grave, and 3 of its 4 sides have etched panels. One is dedicated to his wife Rebecca, who I discussed in chapter 5 of the book, but her identity is very specifically restricted to marital status and religious beliefs. 2 of the other panels are about Morton, and they talk about him as a man of medicine and a man of science. And today, everyone continues to rest in peace, not pieces. His white male and nationalist privilege offering assurance that the physician's skull would never become an object or be subjugated to the same necropolitical techniques that he and colleagues used on others. As for the Native American individuals in the Morton collection, in compliance with a federal law known as the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, 126 of them have been repatriated from Penn Museum, with the transfer of an additional 19 pending. There was actually just one in the news 2 days ago about a child skull that's getting repatriated to the Wabanaki in Maine. The Seminole tribe of Florida, for instance, repatriated their ancestors in October of 2015, and then within days, reburied them in a vault at Lake Okeechobee Battlefield. And as described in the news article, the tribe's chief justice of tribal court, who at the time was Willie Johns, he eulogized, and he said, welcome home, and oh, by the way, did you hear, we won. Your people are still here in Florida, and they're doing well. Now, his words communicate a narrative, not of victimization and violence, but of reunion and retribution. As anthropologists now recognize, it is through the repatriation of the remains of the people in the Morton collection to their descendants that current practitioners may begin to atone for the sins of intellectual forefathers. As a type of reparation, repatriation also requires us to bring empathy and compassion to the fore, which obviously we need more of in the world right now. I think there are other valuable lessons that Morton's legacy and the collection have to impart in today's interesting times. The collection demonstrates that the American body politic has always been a diverse one, despite efforts of erasure by men like Morton and his colleagues. Piecing together the stories of past disenfranchised lives and acknowledging the silences that have made it difficult to flesh them out counters historic white nationalism and xenophobia and their current resurgence. And it calls into question the emulation of historical figures like Andrew Jackson, men of science and politics to continue to evoke as national heroes despite, or perhaps because of, the suffering they cause. The collection, I believe, also urges the repudiation of violence, casual cruelty, and opportunism as admirable attributes of masculinity. Valorizing men who embody these qualities has never served America well. In the mid-1800s, when Morton amassed schools, it led to a nation divided and hardened to suffering, an unfathomable death count, and the increasing fragility of democracy. Perhaps then, in our interesting times, the most important legacy of the Morton collection is to remember, and to quote Mark Twain, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes.